up the client side and we have our components and views, let's create the server side. And here, we're really not going to worry about the client side. We're just going to create API endpoints. So let me create a new README for the backend. So for our server-side code, we're going to need different API endpoints. We're going to have one, which will be /API/athletes, which will return all athletes in the database. This will be a GET request. We're also going to have a GET request for /API/athletes. Actually, before we get into that, let's do the post request. Which will create a new athlete. Then we'll have a GET request for /API/athletes /some ID, which will retrieve a specific athlete. We'll have a put request for /API/athletes /ID, which will update a specific athlete. And then a delete request /API/athletes. I need to spell that correctly. ID, which will delete a specific athlete. Okay? So now that we have that, I'm actually going to create my server. So let's first just run npm init-y in my athletes project, and we'll see this package.json created. So now that I have that, I'm going to create a server.js and actually set up a simple server. Before we can actually set it up though, we're gonna have to start installing our dependencies. So I'm gonna have to install Express and Mongoose. So I'm gonna pause and wait for that to complete. Now that that's complete, I can actually create a simple server. Const express equals require express. I'm gonna create an app.listen. We'll say at port 5000, or you can even do like 8000. This part doesn't matter too much. Console.log, listening at port 8000. Okay? Now that we have that, we should be able to easily run our project. So nodemon server.js. And if I go to Postman, it says cannot get. Well, it looks like it's running, okay? We just need to set up some routes. So it looks like it's good so far. Now that we have that, let's start creating all of the modularized code we'll need in order to set this up. So I'm going to create a new folder called server, and this is where all of our code will live. I have to create a config folder. I have to create a routes, controllers, and lastly, models. Now that I have that, let's create our config for Mongoose. We're going to need mongoose.config.js. So this is actually where we're going to configure Mongoose and set up a connection to a database. And we'll call it athletes project. And then new URL parser true, and use unified topology is true. All right. So we're going to try to connect to our database. And if it connects, we're going to console log established a connection. However, if something goes wrong, let's console log there has been an error. Let's resave. Great. So now that we have that, let's actually require our Mongoose config in our server. Well, we can just do require. And now we can see in our console, we establish a connection. Okay, looks good so far. Now let's create a model for our athlete. I'm going to call it athlete.model.js. After require Mongoose. Let's create a schema. And then we're going to have to think of the fields. There's going to be a first name, type is string, and then let's make it required true and say first name is required. Let me save that and it'll format it a little nicer. We're going to do the same thing for last name as well. And we'll say last name required. Now remember, we also have a sport. We won't make this required. And we have a team, which won't be required either. Let's give it timestamps as well. Okay. So now that we have that, we can actually module.exports.athlete equals mongoose.model athlete. We'll point to the athlete schema. Okay. Let's go back to our server.js and add some configurations which we can then set up our controllers and routes. Okay, so we already required our config. We can also app.use express.json and app.use express.url encoded. True. All right. So now that we have these set up, we have our database set up. Okay. And this is what we needed so we can actually start creating our routes and our controllers to talk to our database. So now that we have that, let's go over to our controllers. I'm going to create athlete.controller.js. Okay? And now that I have that, I need to import my athlete. So I'm going to say import or const athlete equals require models. Oh, I have to actually go up one. Models / athlete.model. And then I'm going to export a list controller, takes in a request and a response. And here we will actually query our database for all of our athletes, okay? So in this, I'm actually going to write a query that will talk to our MongoDB database and return all of the people in our database. And the way we do that is by going athlete.find, then I'll do .then athletes, and I'll say response.json athletes. Okay? So what it's going to try to do is find every athlete, and then we'll have a JSON response that'll be a list of our athletes. If there's an error, let's have a catch, and we'll response.status, we'll send back a 400 and send back the error. Okay? Now that we've set that up, let's go to our routes. I'll say athlete.routes.js. Then in our routes, we'll actually have to link or import our controller. So I'm just going to say const athlete controller equals require controllers athlete controller. And then we can actually create our routes. All right. So the way we're going to create our routes is by module.exports function app. And now we have if we come back over here, what we just set up was return all athletes in the database. So it's going to be a GET request to / athletes athlete controller .list. All right. So we've got that. Let's come back to our server and require our routes. And send in the app. Okay? So if all goes well, what we just did, let's take a step back. We had to do a lot on our backend just to get it running. So we set up our Mongoose configuration and then created a model so we can actually query the database for what's in there. Then we created a controller to actually grab all of the athletes in our database and set up a route so when we go to /API/athletes via a GET request, it will return a list. So we can test this out over here in Postman /API/athletes, and we should get an empty list. Perfect. So that was a lot. We just need to do a lot of setup and configuration just for one route. In the next video, we'll actually set up the rest of the RESTful routes we need.